Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Good evening or good morning, those of you being connected and wherever you are all over the globe. So I'm thrilled to be presenting this second session for today's work. This session dealing with organizations and stakeholders. Let me introduce myself very briefly. My name is Paloma Bilbao. I am a business lecturer, so probably I'm not in the right place. I was commenting before during the coffee break that my research and teaching area is corporate governance, but from a management point of view. And what we say, our colleagues and myself, is that corporate law is the limiting context for corporate governance from a management point of view. So this is going to be very exciting to me. As I mentioned, I'm very, very happy and really honored to be sharing this time with the 4 people that are going to be speaking and discussing today. So this is the agenda for today then. So we'll have one speaker and his discussant first, and then we'll have another speaker and his discussant first. So let me introduce the first speaker and the first discussant. So here is Professor Richard Squire. He is Professor of Law at Fordham University. I believe he's been teaching also at Harvard College and as a visiting professor at Duke School of Law and at the Yale Law School. He publishes primarily on corporate law and corporate bankruptcy, antitrust, and securities regulation. He has been recognized several times for his excellence in teaching, which is something I really appreciate. So congratulations.
Wow,
and he's worked in the Court of Appeals and has practiced as an associate in New York City. So that's a very brief CV of Professor Squire. Let me also present to yourselves Professor Jonathan Lipson, who will be discussing Richard's presentation. Professor Lipson holds the Harold E. Cohn Chair and is a professor of law at Temple University Beasley School of Law. He has also taught at the law schools of the University of Wisconsin, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Baltimore. He researches on corporate governance, restructuring, and contracting practices, and has published on a number of top law journals and reviews. I've read that he won the Editor's Prize as the best paper published in the American Bankruptcy Law Journal in 2016. Congratulations. Professor Lipson is a member of the American Law Institute, a regent of the American College of Commercial Finance Lawyers, and is active with the business law section of the American Bar Association. Prior to teaching, Professor Lipson also practiced corporate and commercial law in different towns and firms. So here it is. So Professor Squire, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to say, first of all, thank you to Maribel for, so that thing that the screen just did you see that? I want to make a point where you just see the presentation appearing over and over again. This encapsulates perfectly the infinite proliferation of subsidiaries in American corporate groups. So I like that representation. Anyway, I'll go back to say, Maribel, thank you so much for organizing this event. It is a wonderful tribute to Henry. I have the great honor of not only being Henry's colleague in the past and past co-author, but also representing him today in the sense that I'm presenting a paper that he and I are both currently the authors of. We are drafting an article together, collapsing the bankrupt corporate group. And I just want to notice something about Henry. Of course, his influence on the field of corporate law is difficult, would be difficult to describe given its vastness, but his influence has also spilled over significantly into bankruptcy law. I became a bankruptcy scholar, essentially, not because I even studied it in law school or practiced in the area. I tell my students after they've already paid their tuition and signed up for my bankruptcy class that I didn't take it in law school. It's too late for them to drop at that point. But I was already a scholar, but I became so interested in bankruptcy law because Henry, along with Radzyner, their theories about asset partitioning and about how they affect the rights of creditors made me fascinated in creditors' rights, which are ultimately cash hashed out in bankruptcy and insolvency proceedings. So his influence on multiple fields has been immense. But also, just on a personal note, he is one of the most gentlemanly and patient people I have met anywhere in the world, but especially in academia, where we are not always known for having those qualities of real graciousness. And just some proof of this, revealed preferences. I have had many co-authors over the course of my career, but very few have been willing to be a repeat co-author, willing to write with me once, suffer that experience, and then do it again. And Henry has been willing to do that, which tells you it's a testimony to his level of patience and his graciousness. So today the paper is collapsing the bankrupt corporate group. Once again, we're talking about corporate groups. It's a mini theme, it seems, of this conference. And we're interested in a problem that I think is primarily a problem in the United States, although I have been reassured is not solely a problem in the United States. And it has to do with the problem of how to treat a corporate group when all of the subsidiaries have filed for bankruptcy. And there is great uncertainty about which assets and which liabilities belong to which subsidiaries within the group. So in the United States and elsewhere, firms enter bankruptcy, and by this I mean insolvency as it's used in the rest of the world. With dozens, if not hundreds of subsidiaries. The United States, I think, has more subsidiaries typically per company than most, per public company than most other countries. And so you have these large entities. And I am thinking here of non-pyramidal style companies, which are the pyramid style of organization is not used much in the United States. So typically our corporate group looks like the slide that Mariana had earlier. So just imagine that slide again. I wish you could insert it into my presentation right now, where you have the parent entity, which is the publicly traded one, and then layers of subsidiaries, all of which are wholly owned directly or indirectly by the parent. I will say more generally that my PowerPoint skills are extremely primitive, and I am envious of people who do it better. Mariana, please send me your slides so that I can use it as a template in the future. I will give you credits. Andreas, the same with you. Your slides are very elegant and stylish, and please send me those as well. In 6-point font at the bottom, I will give you credit in future presentations. Please know that it is my opinion that the ideas that I will be presenting today are more sophisticated than the style of presentation on the slides. So anyway, but imagine that slide again from Mariana. This is what I have in mind. In the United States, there is no requirement at the level of state, and it's the states that govern that provide the corporate law in the United States, most of it. There's no requirement that each corporate entity maintain accurate books and records. They can maintain it if the directors want them to, or if investors ask for it. But in a corporate group, the group almost invariably reports on a consolidated basis. And so nobody is keeping close track of which assets and liabilities properly belong to which subsidiaries. Also, there's very little, so that's kind of, I guess, record keeping, you could think of it. Or sorry, that would be kind of the books, the balance sheets and so on. There's also very little record keeping in terms of transactions amongst the entities, transferring value amongst them. Because again, who cares? The shareholders only own an interest in the parent. They are only interested, therefore, in the performance of the group as a group, in the consolidated performance. The Securities and Exchange Commission only requires consolidated reporting, and so there's no point really in investing in accurate subsidiary level records. This is fine until the whole thing ends up in bankruptcy, because each subsidiary has its own its own creditors, its own claims, and in theory, the claims would be just against the assets held in that subsidiary. But if you don't know where the assets belong and where the liabilities belong, it's very hard to calculate proper payout entitlements for the various claimants, for the various creditors. In order to figure out, sometimes the term is used, untangle the spaghetti is the term that our courts will use, which assets and liabilities properly belong to which entity, you would have to incur very high administrative costs. You would have to pay accountants a lot to figure out where the assets and liabilities go. And then you would pay lawyers a lot to fight about whether the accountants got it right. And in addition, besides this untangling cost, there is also a great payout variability as a result. Some entities, some creditors will kind of get lucky because it will be found that most of the assets actually belonged in their particular subsidiary. So they'll get a high payout and others will get a lower payout. So this is the problem. It's administrative, but also an efficiency problem faced in American bankruptcy proceedings. So let me give you an illustration. This was a famous case, the Owens Corning case, which I'll talk about later. This goes all the way back to 2005. Owens Corning, a manufacturer of various types of, ceramic style metals. I want to say plexiglass. It's now eluding me what exactly it is that they made, but silicon related materials. There was a parent corporation which had all of the public shareholders. It held all of the equity in 17 distinct subsidiaries. The subsidiaries is where the real assets were, not the financial assets, but the real value in the company. The subsidiaries had their own creditors, trade creditors, bank claimants, and so on. Now, in addition, before it filed for bankruptcy about a year beforehand, Owens Corning wanted to engage in a leveraged buyout and buy another company called Fiberboard. To do so, it borrowed $2 billion, unusually on an unsecured basis, from a syndicate of banks. But the banks just didn't want to lend their money to Owens Corning parent. They also wanted upstream guarantees from the subsidiaries, which makes sense. That's where all the value is. And so they got 17 distinct upstream claims. Now, in the bankruptcy proceeding, there was a proposal by the debtor to the debtor's managers. It was a reorganization proceeding with the debtor in possession being the model, that the group be substantively consolidated. This is the remedy that is used often for corporate groups in the United States. The way it's used in the United States, there are two consequences. First of all, there's balance pooling, or you might think of asset and liability pooling. All of the assets and liabilities are put into a common pool, and the creditors' payout entitlements and their voting rights in a reorganization are calculated based on this common pool. It's as if you had a merger of all of them into one, but there's no actual merger. There's kind of a deemed merger for purposes of the bankruptcy proceeding. This greatly simplifies the proceeding. The other consequence is that the guarantees are canceled. The logic behind this is, well, the bank syndicate, if it has outside of in the absence of a consolidation, 18 different claims, right? A claim against the parent and then a separate guarantee-based claim against each subsidiary. Well, you can't have 18 different claims if there's only now one de facto entity that exists, because we pulled it all into one. So all of the guarantees are canceled. Obviously, the bank syndicate did not like this because this greatly reduces their expected payout after the fact. I'll illustrate this later. Other creditors said, well, this is actually better for us. Not only is there less money for the bank, so more money for the rest of us, but it's also simpler. We don't have to spend a lot of money on lawyers and accountants. I almost said unscrambling the eggs. It's funny how cooking is often used here. Before it was untangling the spaghetti. Anyway, whichever one you like, breakfast or dinner, it's the same idea. It's expensive to undo what you have done. Okay, so that is the standard solution in American bankruptcy law. Substantive consolidation, which has those two features: balance sheet pooling of all unsecured creditor claims and liabilities, and the intergroup guarantees are ignored. There are clear manifest benefits. There is no doubt about this. One is lower administrative costs. You don't have these sorting out expenses. In the draft that Jonathan has read and it was posted, we didn't make this argument, but I started to think about more that you could justify this aspect of the solution from the perspective of the hypothetical creditor's bargain ex ante. Thomas Jackson in the United States has written about the hypothetical creditor's bargain. Let's think about it this way. We are all lending to different subsidiaries in a corporate group. And ex ante, we don't know when we make the loan, in case of an insolvency proceeding, which subsidiaries are going to have more value and which subsidiaries are going to have less value. Why don't we know? Well, we assume that the group as a whole is going to be what's going to determine whether the group becomes insolvent or not. So we're based on the business prospects of the group as a whole. We're not looking at subsidiary level records. We also know that even if we got initial balance sheets, the managers would move the value around after the fact, like in a shell game. So we are just lending to the group as a whole. Under that perspective, it might be more rational for us, and I'm even thinking now of the famous, the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. We don't know which one we're going to have, which subsidiary is going to have more or less value beforehand, to all agree beforehand that we will have our payouts based on the average value of the entire group of the subsidiaries rather than on the particular subsidiary to which we lent. That will have lower administrative costs for us. It will also increase the value of our claims under standard portfolio theory, right? Would you rather have a claim against one asset, if you think about each subsidiary as an asset within the group, that can vary a great in value, or would you rather have the same claim with the same expected value against the whole diversified portfolio of all the subsidiaries? Well, the question answers itself. So I think portfolio theory would also argue in favor of the ex ante pooling, the hypothetical creditor's bargain. There's another reason why we would want that, was that it would reduce the expected agency costs of debt. Managers might have the incentive in the group to play a shell game, which is, we've all seen companies do this. One subsidiary borrows against its assets. Then after that debt is in place, the assets are moved to a different subsidiary and it borrows against them again. And so you keep selling the same rug to different buyers. This is a rug merchant's stereotype that my parents gave me when I was growing up. They said, don't trust rug merchants. They will keep selling the same rug to multiple people. I have no idea where this ugly stereotype got into my family, but it's there, and now I'm telling it to you now. But corporate managers are like these rug merchants. They keep borrowing against the same assets over and over again by moving them around. But if the whole group is going to be pooled after the fact, that doesn't work, because your claim goes with the assets effectively. You have a pool asset against them all. So there are clear benefits to substantive consolidation. Now, the creditor's bargain, however, could be not accurate if some creditors really did expect to have a claim against a particular subsidiary rather than against the whole group. So in our view in the paper, the claim, the interesting question is, when is that likely to be the case? And how could you be able to tell that if you were a court? Do I have a target time when I'm supposed to stop talking?
Yes,
Yes.
4:50, like
Dinner.
25.
Dinner.
4:50.
Yeah.
16:50. Yes.
Sorry, this is very Spanish.
You said, no, I speak Spanish time. I don't speak Spanish temperatures. If you say, what is it, 35 degrees? Oh yeah, I don't understand what that means, but 16:50, okay. I don't speak Celsius. Okay, I will keep going. Okay, good. So here, I want to just go back a second to illustrate the big difference that whether or not you enforce those guarantees can make. This is a much simpler structure than I'm showing now than we saw in the Owens Corning case. But imagine you have a parent corporation and a subsidiary corporation. This is the simplest possible corporate group, I believe. The parent has $50 in assets once we end up in a bankruptcy proceeding, and the subsidiary has $50 in assets. All of my loans here are going to be unsecured to make it simple. The bank has lent $100 to the parent, but being smart and having good lawyers, the bank has also asked for an upstream guarantee from the subsidiary. Okay, the subsidiary has its own creditors. These could be trade creditors, these could be tort claimants, these could be bondholders, also of $100. I made it a debenture holder here, which is how we say in America an unsecured bondholder, a debenture holder. Sorry, America, the United States. There is tremendous controversy, I know, in the Spanish-speaking world about what America refers to, and also how many continents there are in the New World. Everybody in the United States, and I think in England, learns there are 2 continents. In Spain and in Latin America, they learn there are 1 continent with 2 parts. This is a fierce debate that I feel very passionately about, but I'm not going to go into it more here. I will say the United States. Okay, so in the United States, we have, we call it a debenture. That's what I was saying. I will try not to go off too many tangents anymore. How do we calculate the recoveries? Well, let's assume, first of all, that there is no substantive consolidation, that the parent and the subsidiary, although they're administratively consolidated, they're in front of the same bankruptcy judge, they are substantively treated separately. Well, the bank will recover, because it's the only creditor of the parent, the $50 from the parent. In addition, it will put in a $100 claim on the guarantee against the subsidiary. You immediately are thinking a $100 claim. No, 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 no. It's a $50 claim, because the bank has already recovered $50 from the parent. Yes, in the United States, the bank is allowed to double prove the claim, the full amount. It's not just the deficiency claim. This is evil, and it is allowed. Also, a $100 claim is put in against the subsidiary. So the subsidiary has two $100 claims against it. The claim by the bank for $100 and the claim by the debenture holder for $100. The subsidiary has $50 in assets. According to the pro rata rule, $25 goes to the bank, giving a total recovery. So you can see the total recovery there for the bank of $75. That leaves just $25 for the debenture holder. So the bank gets more. It's like having priority. If we did it so that the bank just put in a $50 deficiency claim, it would still recover more. The recovers would be $67 and $33, but the bank still gets more. Now, imagine you are the bank, but you don't have one claim. You have 18 different subsidiary claims. Well, pretty darn quickly, you get to a 100% recovery, as if you were a fully secured creditor. Now, you cannot go above $100 under American law. They say that you can double prove, but you can't double recover. I don't know how this is related to double dipping, but and what that refers to. But anyway, but pretty quickly, the bank syndicate back in Owens Corning would get its full $2 billion if the guarantees were enforced. Now, what if we consolidate? Well, if we consolidate, we put all of the assets together, we ignore the guarantees. It's very straightforward. The bank has a $100 claim, the debenture holder has a $100 claim, that's $200 in claims, $100 in total assets, 50 from each of the subsidiary and the parent. We apply the pro rata rule, 50-50, they each get $50. So there is a big distributional consequence to substantive consolidation when consolidation also entails cancellation of guarantees. Okay, now, substantive consolidation entails objections. I told you the benefits. I made this case about under the hypothetical creditor's bargain. This is what we would all do under the Rawlsian veil of ignorance ex ante. By the way, I am not a fan in any other context of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. I am shocked that I am citing it favorably in this context. But as we get older, we learn more. So that has happened to me. You've seen an epiphany right in front of your eyes. Okay, don't apply it to anything else, please, however. Okay, so legal objections. First of all, substantive consolidation is not authorized by the bankruptcy statute. Incredibly, it is one of the most powerful remedies, or I should say consequential remedies, for changing creditor payouts, and yet there's nothing in the bankruptcy code that says that you can do it. Does that stop American bankruptcy judges? Never. They say the statute has some useful suggestions in it, but ultimately we do equity, which is fairness, which means grab your wallet. Okay. Also, there's another objection, which is the corporate form is ignored. Formally, there is a problem here in that corporate walls, internal asset partitions, asset partitioning, the great Hansmann-Crackman insight, is disregarded. This can disappoint creditors on two levels. Creditors who expected their payouts to be tied to the value of a particular entity, they don't get that anymore. And creditors who have multiple claims because of subsidiaries, that is lost as well. I want you to notice that guarantees, these intergroup guarantees, have two potential functions, and only one of them is destroyed by substantive consolidation. They call that one is an opportunistic or offensive, and this is terms of offense, taking from other people. Offensive has the secondary meaning in English as being something that you don't do in polite company. I also think this word applies to the intergroup guarantees, but it's not necessarily what I meant. It means higher recoveries for the creditors, lowers for others. I think this is pure correlation seeking, a type of opportunism that increases the agency costs of debt. So in that sense, substantive consolidation by canceling that is good. However, intergroup guarantees have a defensive function. If you are worried that after you will lend to one subsidiary, the managers will move the assets to a second subsidiary and borrow from that one. Well, if I get a guarantee from the second subsidiary, I'm protected. I have claims now. They move the assets around, do whatever you want. I'm chill, as the kids say, because my claim is against the whole group. This is a self-protective function, and I think it is a beneficial function. But notice, substantive consolidation achieves the same result without the guarantees because it pools all of the assets and liabilities together. We have a bit of a split amongst the courts in the United States. At the circuit court level, the courts say, and the court in the Owens-Corning case said, that substantive consolidation should be done sparingly, not very often. Why? Well, it's kind of a formalistic approach. They say that first of all, these creditors have bargained for these guarantees, and so they should get the benefit of the bargain, so you shouldn't cancel them. And they say that therefore you should only do the consolidation when the administrative cost savings would be so great that all creditors would be made better off, kind of Pareto optimality. Given the massive redistribution of value from substantive consolidation, this is almost never satisfied. There's almost some creditor who says, I don't care if you spend half of the assets of the company on untangling the spaghetti, as long as I get the first claim on the remaining meatball, I am still better off. So it's supposed to be uncommon. Bankruptcy courts do it commonly. How does that happen? Well, they say something like this. The circuit courts, which are courts of appeals in the United States, say that I'm supposed to only do this very rarely, very sparingly. As it happens, but I am finding that I'm going to do it in this particular case. It is warranted in this particular case. As it happens, this is the third case this week that I am doing substantive consolidation sparingly. Okay, why is there this division? Well, I think it's because it's a practical matter. The bankruptcy judges don't want these long drawn-out proceedings. They don't want lawyers and accountants coming in and vacuuming out all of the value. But the appellate courts, I think, don't fully understand the limited function of entity partitioning, in particular, internal asset entity partitioning in corporate groups. So who's right? Formally, I think it has to be true that the circuit courts are right. This should be done sparingly. As a functional matter, our view in this paper is that the bankruptcy courts probably are closer to correct. Functionally, substantive consolidation does have a useful role. Why is that? Well, we have to look at why do we have subsidiaries and corporate groups in the first place? And is this function being undermined by substantive consolidation? Now, there have been many papers that have written about the function of subsidiaries, and Henry has written papers about it. Henry and I have written papers about it. There are asset partitioning functions. If you confine the creditors to their particular subsidiaries, this can reduce creditor information costs. This can facilitate control transfers. Henry and I wrote a paper in 2016 talking about the benefits of internal asset partitioning, that's within a corporate group in particular. This can correct debt overhang problems. This can facilitate equity holder diversification. You can ring fence your tort liability. That's good or bad, depending on whether you like tort creditors and their plaintiffs' attorneys to get paid or not. So these are potential benefits that substantive consolidation undermines. However, they only arise, and I have another metaphor, this area is bristling with metaphors. These only arise if your corporate group is something like a cargo ship on the ocean with watertight compartments, where if you have spillage in one compartment, it doesn't spill over to the other compartments and sink the whole ship. You remember the movie Titanic. The problem in Titanic was that when they hit the iceberg, it opened up 5 compartments. If it had just been 4, it would have floated, but it broke open 5 and therefore it sank. I know that because that's what it said in the movie Titanic, which was accurate in every historical detail, I am sure. So under the model of watertight compartments, each subsidiary would have its own accurate books and records. And there would be no intergroup guarantees because a guarantee allows liability from one compartment to spill over into the others, just like water overflowing and breaking down the whole ship. Maybe it's bad taste for me to talk about Titanic and given events in the recent week. I apologize for that. But moving on, I totally forgot. That only had one compartment, which is even worse. So, but these are not common in practice. What we actually observe in corporate groups is that, at least typically in the United States, there is no entity level record keeping, and there is no watertight compartment. Subsidiaries are common. The intergroup trade groups are common. Now, there are other functions of corporate subsidiaries. You could use them for distinct tax and regulatory domiciles. And Mariana has talked a great deal about how through regulatory peaking, regulators sometimes try to undermine this type of partitioning, this regulatory partitioning. You also, Henry, along with Ken Ayat in 2013, wrote about keeping transferable bundles of contracts. But that is preserved. Nothing about substantive consolidation undermines that, because the subsidiaries can survive the proceeding even if you have substantive consolidation just for purposes of creditor payouts. You can have selective enforcement of just putting one subsidiary or another into bankruptcy. Tony Casey has written about why creditors might want that. Now, Andreas tells us today about how the parent might want that. But as long as you don't have substantive consolidation between subsidiaries that are in bankruptcy and non-debtor subsidiaries, and that doesn't happen very often in the United States, that's not undermined either. So if these are the main functions for subsidiaries, then substantive consolidation does not undermine them. Okay, so Henry and I in the paper say maybe we should take a more functional approach to substantive consolidation. To the extent that there is evidence that ex ante the creditors really did want their claims to be based on the group as a whole, the value of the group as a whole, then that should be allowed. It will reduce administrative costs and give them the benefit of portfolio theory for their claims. What would be evidence that they were okay, or they even preferred a consolidated payout? First of all, they did not demand accurate subsidiary level records, and second of all, they asked for guarantees, which tied their recoveries more to that as the group as a whole. Now you may say, well, wait a minute, what about those creditors who got guarantees and they wanted to be able to prove multiple claims? Another thing that we think is new in this paper is that we're saying that those two things can be fully separated. Right now, it's all or nothing under American law. You either have separate balance sheets and you enforce all the guarantees, or you consolidate the balance sheets and you cancel the guarantees. But there are two other possibilities, which is you consolidate the balance sheets but enforce multiple guarantees, and you could cancel the guarantees and keep the balance sheets separate. There's no reason that we would say that you have to do it all. We also, and I'm going to illustrate that in a moment, I'm getting close to the end. Also, it doesn't have to be all or nothing, and Mariana talked earlier about how this doesn't have to be all or nothing. You could have a particular subsidiary, well, it's clear the creditors wanted to keep it separate. They asked for accurate books and records. They said no guarantees can be issued, and you could keep that subsidiary second but pool the rest of them. Nothing would suggest you can't do that. Courts, because they have an all or nothing mentality, are doing that now. We think tailored pooling would be appropriate. Okay, so how would you do pooling? You would pool the claims, but you would not cancel the guarantees, which is not allowed now. But how would you do that? And I tried to think of a term for this. And I'm calling this pooling with double dipping, because pooling suggests you're going swimming, double dipping suggests you're going swimming. So if you don't like it, it's okay. But I'm calling this PWDD, pooling with double dipping. How would you do it? So I have the recoveries if you're separate before, but now recovery if pooling with double dipping. How do we calculate it for the bank? Well, now the total claims for the pooled entity are $300. Sorry, the pooled group are $300. You have a $100 claim against the parent, you have a $100 claim against the subsidiary, and you have a $100 claim by the debenture holder. So there's $300 in total claims. The assets are still $100, so the pro rata percentage recovery is 33%. The bank has $200 in claims, so it gets 2/3 or 67, and the debenture holder gets 33% of 100 or 33. So I get all of the administrative benefits of pooling. I don't care which assets and liabilities belong where, but I'm still giving the bank its higher recovery. Do I recommend this? No, I don't think the bank should get the higher recovery because that is correlation seeking, and I can send you my papers on that if you're interested in it. But I'm just pointing out that you don't have to put the two together. You can do it completely separately. The last objection may be, well, wait a minute. How is it possible that a court has the power to do this, to simultaneously consolidate the balance sheets but enforce the guarantees? And I say this is more modest than what bank courts do currently, which is they both consolidate the balance sheets and they cancel the guarantees. This is actually more modest. It doesn't seem that way at first because it's creative, but it actually comes closer to enforcing creditor contract rights than they had otherwise. I'm done. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank
There you go.
Infinite proliferation of subsidiaries. Thank you for showing that once again.
Thank you, Richard. So Jonathan, your turn. You have 10 to 15 minutes.
10 to 15
Okay.
minutes, not a problem. While Miguel gets the slides up, I just wanted to say a couple of quick introductory things. First, Richard, it's a great paper. I've got a lot of things to say about it, but I like the paper a lot, Richard and Henry. I wanted to thank the organizers, Maribel, Abel, and Miguel for inviting me. That's not me.
Would you like to use Andreas'
nice to
slides? They're really good. Look how professional they are.
They're much better than mine,
Yeah,
just
they
so
have
you
great
know.
style.
They're much better than mine.
Always nice to remember.
You could use those again. Oh, yours look good too. No, that's pretty good. Yeah, okay. We'll go with yours.
Yeah, Squires are much better than mine, so don't lower your expectations immediately when it comes to slides.
Aren't they, Joe?
So thank you all for inviting me and for using my slides. I also just wanted to mention that Paloma had her very gracious introduction mentioned that I've been involved with the American Bar Association, and one of the reasons I mention that now is because I'm a member of the Corporate Laws Committee, which is the group that has written and maintains a model act called the Model Business Corporation Act. It's the alternative to the Delaware General Corporation Law. It's been enacted in 36 jurisdictions. And so I probably have a bias in favor of entity formalism, just because I spend so much time with these corporate law folks. So forgive me for that if that's the case. I also wanted to say one word about Professor Hansmann. I'm 100% sure he doesn't remember me at all. I think we met maybe once at a conference in Canada. I asked an incredibly stupid question. I was a baby law professor, and I don't even remember what it was, but it wasn't a particularly intelligent question. And as Richard suggests, he was incredibly gracious in not making me feel like it was not a very good question. It was a very nice experience. So I'm going to start. Obviously, the title here is, it's an American convention, I suppose, to take the word wither and put the letter H in an apostrophe, in parentheses rather, to sort of invite the double entendre that you both are thinking about the withering of something, the loss of it, meaning, W-I-T-H-E-R, and also where are we going, W-I-T-H-E-R, which direction are we going in, wither structure. The comments on collapsing the bankrupt corporate group by Henry and Richard have led me to just think about where we're going with corporate structure in the bankruptcy setting. I think everybody already knows this, but just a quick kind of overview. U.S. law depends, I think, very heavily on respecting the corporate form. As I say, I may be biased in this way, but I think, Macy says it as well as anybody, corporate separateness is now firmly ingrained in our legal culture and in the sensibilities of lawyers and investors. Substantive consolidation is an important exception of some sort to this, but it's uncertain in many, many ways. And I know this in part because when I was a lawyer for a little bit, I was a bankruptcy lawyer, and substantive consolidation of one form or another was routine. Usually it happened not because there were intercompany guarantees, but simply because there were intercompany claims, and the record keeping, as Richard and Henry suggest, was a disaster. Richard's talking about swimming metaphors, pool metaphors, and the metaphor that I was reminded of is the old phrase that, when the tide goes out, we all learn who's not wearing a swimsuit. And that's sort of by analogy, I think, part of what you see when companies go into bankruptcy. That if there are lots of, if the company's in bankruptcy, everybody's underwater, or out of water, I guess, and all of a sudden you realize that actually that they haven't properly clothed themselves. And you don't really know, nobody knows inside the company or out, who owes what to whom. So substantive consolidation is a really important problem. I think in the real world, it's not gotten a great deal of attention. So I think the paper is great for looking at it. But some of the uncertainties involve things like this. When will or should it happen? Because the bankruptcy code says nothing about it, we can't predict very accurately when it will occur or the standards by which a court will say yes or no. We also don't know whether it solves an ex-ante signaling problem or an ex-post distributive problem. Richard mentioned that there are sort of a couple of different approaches that courts take. And I think, roughly speaking, those are the two different types of things courts are thinking about. Do we worry that creditors external to the companies relied on the individual assets and boundaries? Or do we just think, well, we just want to do the right thing? And we're really concerned that some creditors are victims, and otherwise, if we don't mix it all together, we'll hurt them in some way. Who must show what? What is the effect of substantive consolidation? Is it actually a forced merger? Well, not really in a corporate law sense, but from an economic perspective for the creditors, it might be. Is it just merely pooling assets? Is it just an accounting trick? Certainly, I think, in my experience as a lawyer, substantive consolidation was frequently used simply as an accounting trick, so that the debtor would produce a disclosure statement that reports on a consolidated basis and then classifies creditors in a variety of ways and makes payments promised under the plan, according to the plan, almost entirely indifferent to the specific claims that specific creditors have against specific subsidiaries. And that's, I think, what's happened frequently. It's not always understood as substantive consolidation, but it happens a great deal. The paper, I think, is very nicely situated in the third of the three stages of law and economics. Richard's talking about the creditor's bargain. Of course, that I think of as a kind of Rawlsian exercise, that we want to know, well, what would creditors have wanted if they thought to ask? What should they have wanted? What would rational creditors do? 20 years later, I think you see a kind of rethinking of that, and Baird and Rasmussen, among others, say, well, actually, we shouldn't really focus so much on what folks should have asked. What we want to know is, like, what's the bargaining after the fall, right? And really what that's going to be is about selling the company. So it's the end of bankruptcy, for them, and I think for many people in the early 2000s. And now we're, I think, at a third stage, and I think this paper fits well within that third stage. This, represented by Tony Casey's new bargaining theory, which I think really focuses on agreements amongst parties negotiated during the bankruptcy, maybe for reorganization, maybe for sale. And those agreements, those deals, really should take precedence over whatever formal law might dictate. That formal law, formalities, really are problematic in bankruptcy. Rich says, well, equity means grab your wallet. Well, equity can also mean grab somebody else's wallet. And I think, that's, for better and for worse, what ends up happening in bankruptcy. I think folks try to do the right thing, but it's hard. So Squire and Hansmann make three claims. I just want to mention a couple things about them and then ask them some questions to think about. So the first claim is, there's no reason to resist substantive consolidation. They say there's no good economic or fundamental reason for bias against it that would counsel in favor of merely sparing usage. And I think that's probably right. But of course, at least under US law, capital does rely on respect for entity autonomy. And so I think it's important to account for that. I worry a little bit that this might encourage strategic bankruptcy filings, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Strategic use of bankruptcy, to deal with, some entities in the bankruptcy process where you could consolidate, but not the others where you don't. Number two, they say we should decouple accounting and legal consolidation. Balance sheet consolidation, the cancellation of intragroup guarantees can and should be decoupled. I think that's right, but I would ask empirically, how often are they actually coupled? I think one of the things that I might think about in this paper is expanding the focus from guarantees to intercompany claims more generally. The model for the paper is the Owens-Corning case, which is a famous and controversial case. But in many cases, you still have the same problems without multiple subsidiary guarantees. Nevertheless, the problem plays out because you have intercompany claims that may or may not be realized in the bankruptcy process. And the decision whether to realize and honor those intercompany claims can produce very different results for just the reasons that the guarantees can. The recognition or not of those claims will affect external creditors. Third claim is that this solution, they provide a solution to ex-ante signaling failures. They say courts should refrain from balance sheet consolidation only when the savings in terms of administrative expenses would be minimal, or when a group has maintained accurate subsidiary level financial records, as these are evidence that creditors relied upon the group's internal asset partitions to economize on their information costs. And, you know, I immediately, of course, wonder, well, how do we account for non-reliance creditors in this setting? Now, one answer is we just don't care about them, or that's another system entirely, you know, or we need to think about, you know, where in the process, when we're thinking about consolidation, we should consider the interests of non-reliance creditors. I also wonder how you engage in the comparison that I think you have in mind, which is the comparison of administrative expenses saved to the realization of gains to creditors on a consolidated basis. And the reason I think that's difficult is simply because, you know, the administrative expenses of reorganization can be extraordinarily high. I mean, one of my favorite cases for, you know, substantive consolidation right now is FTX, which has, you know, scores of subsidiaries, none of which maintained a single corporate record. And so far, I think Sullivan and Cromwell's built like, what, $200 million? Like, it's extraordinary how much they've built in reconstructing the books in that case. It's going to be good to be a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. And of course, if that's true, why would lawyers and accountants ever want to embrace this approach? It's against their interests.
They wouldn't, Jonathan. That's an easy one. That's our problem. They
Yeah, that's your problem.
Yes.
So you've got to figure out a way to sell them on this.
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge. So I think those are the three claims, and those are my kind of quick reactions. I had a couple of questions that I would, I guess, that came to my mind that you might want to think about as well. First, the role and effect of non-debtor affiliates. You straight up say, well, look, we endorse substantive consolidation in this article, but only with respect to co-debtors. That is, to affiliated entities that have not already filed for bankruptcy. Fair enough. But why? Shouldn't the reliance and signaling analysis that I think is the third, you know, part of the claim apply equally to the whole group? More importantly is the rise of what we in the US call the Texas two-step. How many folks have heard of the Texas two-step? Anybody? One or two folks? So the Texas two-step is this idea that under the law of certain states, Texas and its corporations law, Delaware and its limited partnership law, not corporate law yet, permits the division of a single entity into more than one entity and the shifting of all liabilities to that. It's a legal form of the ring fencing that I think Henry and Richard have written about in the past. And this has been used recently by several asbestos companies and most recently by Johnson & Johnson, the consumer products company, to try to manage its talcum powder tort liability, just about tort. They, you know, created a bad co that has all the debt, put that into bankruptcy. They keep the healthy operating company, OpCo, out of bankruptcy, chiefly because they want to be able to control how much they pay, and they don't want bankruptcy courts or creditors sniffing around in the operations of the operating company, which is not, it's totally understandable. But the question then is, well, you know, that strategic decision, who gets filed, right, can really then determine a lot of other outcomes. So perhaps you want to think a little bit more about when to drag non-debtors in. There is case law that permits it. The St. Paul diocesan case from 2019 is an Eighth Circuit opinion that does it. I think it's a very problematic doctrine, so I'm not encouraging it, but it certainly happened. The other related point is about special purpose or bankruptcy remote entities. So, you know, we've all got a general sense of how, you know, asset securitization and structured financing works. And of course, you know, creditors long ago figured out that if you want to be really sure that you can predict your payouts, you just make sure that you have a special purpose entity as your borrower that has assets that cannot go into bankruptcy and that, you know, is controlled in ways that will provide comfort to you. Those entities have gotten, you know, pushed around a little bit. You see some of that in the general growth properties opinion, but I might also think about how to account for that. And I have to confess, I don't know where the state of the law is on on the respect that bankruptcy courts give to them. Question number 2, what is the role? It would be, I think, helpful to talk more about the role and effect of collateral, right? Because an answer to many of the questions that you offer is Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code. If you care about asset specificity, if you care about knowing what you're going to get from your debtor, just take a security interest in the debtor's assets. And I say, well, okay, but there's the rug merchant problem and they can play 3-card Monte and shift assets. But of course, the security interest continues in those assets. And so you're as fully protected in that scenario as you would be without that sort of gamesmanship. So, Article 9 is a very simple way of solving some of these problems. And in the context of substantive consolidation, it presents, I think, difficult problems because, of course, you do have to account for the different kinds of asset pools or different valuations of assets at different entities and the different levels of claims directly to those assets when you think about this. So even if you might avoid some administrative expenses in substantive consolidation, you don't avoid all of them because you do have to figure out who's got collateral and what's it worth. And then the third is a distinction that Bill Wyden, I think, first pointed out in his empirical work on substantive consolidation in 2004 and 2005, which you cite, between contested and uncontested consolidations. So one of the questions that I think is important and you explore a little bit is, well, procedurally, how does this happen? Well, typically it happens at a plan of reorganization. Well, the reason bankruptcy courts do it sort of magically, and we don't really know exactly what standards apply, is because it's just thrown into the plan and people, vote on the plan without reading it and vote on the plan without thinking about it. And all of a sudden they're getting a payout, which may or may not be what they want. When you have a significantly positive vote for a plan that substantively consolidates entities, that's frequently viewed as an uncontested consolidation because there's no challenge to it specifically and the plan itself approves it. That's very common, and that's certainly what I saw a great deal of in practice. Opposition to substantive consolidation is fairly rare, and I think it requires a case like Owens Corning where you have significant reliance by particular creditors in a particular deal under particularly bad facts and an appellate judge who's motivated by high principles rather than the sort of difficulties of the real world. But to the extent we're thinking about transaction costs, whether they're administrative costs of verification and measurement or litigation, I think you want to think about those. And so if we are going to encourage substantive consolidation, we probably need to think about the fact that we're going to encourage more folks to contest those substantive consolidations, and those contests are not costless either. But I think it's a great paper. I think you're looking at a really important problem that has received far too little attention. So thank you for doing it, and thank you for asking me to talk about it.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we're going to go to passing to the following speaker and discussion. And then we'll have some time at the end of the session for some debate and questions. All right. So, as you wish. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Jonathan. So here we go. So let me please introduce you to our next speaker, Professor Amir Licht. I hope I am pronouncing it properly.
Yeah.
No?
Perfectly.
Probably not, but anyway, sorry about that. Professor Amir Licht is Professor of Law at the Harry Radzyner Law School of the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya in Israel. He has also taught as a visiting professor at the Ball Hall School of Law, University of California, Berkeley. He publishes on comparative corporate governance, psychological dimensions of governance, and international securities regulation. He was dean of the Interdisciplinary Center of Herzliya, and he has also served as an independent advisor to the Israeli Securities Authority and the Ministry of Justice. And he is one of these scholars that I've read anxiously and always very interested. So welcome, Amir. And let me also introduce you to Professor Carsten Gerner-Beuerle.
Perfect.
Thank you. Professor Carsten Gerner-Beuerle is a professor at the commercial law at University College London. He has also worked at the London School of Economics, King's College London, and Humboldt University in Berlin. He has also held visiting positions in various institutions in Europe and the United States, including Trinity College in Dublin, the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods, and Duke University. He regularly advises a German law firm on matters of corporate law and corporate insolvency, and he has prepared studies for the European Commission and the European Parliament on the reform of corporate governance, financial regulation, and private international law. So welcome, Carsten.
Thank you.
So we have Amir 25 to 30 minutes for your presentation. So this makes, let me make the calculation.
Even less.
This makes something like 5:40 to be ending.
Yeah, I hope to be even quicker. But let me say some thanks first. First of all, thanks to you, Paloma, for an overly generous introduction. Then sincere thanks to Maribel for pulling this off and having me on the program. And special thanks to Carsten. We chatted during lunch about this paper, and I suspect that his comments are going to be better than the paper itself. So thank you for reading it so carefully. So this is in line with the title. This is a little and unambitious paper, and in line with that, I will try to be as brief as possible. It basically, I mean, the presenting it today here is, I think, is a special homage to Henry, because I have to tell you that this is there's another paper not given about stakeholders and so on, and perhaps enough was said about stakeholders. We should take a pause and discuss other things. So again, this particular paper, I think, chimes with a paper that Henry co-authored with Ron Gilson and Mariana here, which is actually is a personal favorite of mine. It's called Regulatory Dualism as a Development Strategy, Corporate Reform in Brazil, the United States, and the European Union. In my mind, it's a seminal paper. It's an eye-opener, so to speak. It combines good theory with a real-life awareness in a real-life setting. And again, it's a personal favorite item. I teach it regularly in many courses that I teach. And Ron, Henry, and Mariana's paper tells a story about a stock market, not necessarily a small one, but the Bovespa, the São Paulo Stock Exchange, that faced a corporate governance impasse. It was caught in a low-quality trap, so to speak. So in order to develop, it implemented a voluntary high-quality trading list, the Novo Mercado. And that turned out to be a major success. The present paper is called The Little Market That Could, and connotes a famous children's book called The Little Engine That Could. And it has a similar plot line, but quite the opposite to Henry and Ron and Mariana's paper. So it's a story about a stock market, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, the TASE, that faced the corporate governance impasse again, but it was caught in a high-quality trap. In order to survive, it implemented a voluntary low-quality trading list, the dual listing arrangement, the DLA, and lo and behold, it proved to be a major success. However, 22 years and counting after the DLA was legislated and implemented, it remains an unfinished business. So even though it's a story about a small market in a small country, there are certain lessons that could be learned, I believe, and this is why the paper is here. You could frame or imagine the problem that the TASE, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, faced as David's dilemma. It's a you can see that, comparing with the Goliath US markets, the taste was truly a minuscule David. And between 1996 and 1998, the taste was essentially drying up. There was a rising high-tech sector in Israel, a thriving one, and Israeli companies, startup companies, high-tech companies were essentially skipping the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange and went directly to NASDAQ. Because in their mind, the Goliath US markets seemed more attractive. I bet the Goliath here looks more attractive to the men and the women as well. Now, that was perfectly logical. For a small startup company that seeks equity, especially equity capital, the way to go to NASDAQ as an exit avenue was the logical way to choose, because there was no sense in going first to list in Tel Aviv and then comply with a double regime of securities regulation in 2 different languages, different accounting principles. It just made no sense. There was nothing that the big guy could offer, that the little guy could offer that the bigger guy could not. The thing is that a committee was appointed at that time to look for ways to attract those Israeli issuers, Israeli companies that skipped Israel or skipped Tel Aviv. And the committee discovered what people knew all along, that in the US there are actually 2 securities regulation regimes. And foreign private issuers, Israelis among others, they usually comply with the low quality regime. It's colloquially named after the annual reporting form 20F. So they reported under a more lenient, less demanding, less strict regime. And the committee at the time said, well, we would like to have the Israeli come back home and list as a dual listing in Tel Aviv, but on condition that they comply with a higher quality US regime. That's again called colloquially after the annual reporting form 10K, which is designed for American issuers. So foreign private issuers comply with the low quality regime, and the American issuers, the US issuers, comply with a higher quality. And the committee looked for that 10K regime and found it quite equivalent to the Israeli one. And that made perfect sense. You want to come to Israel, you could disclose that you could talk in English, but substantively, you need to comply with a higher quality regime. However, between 1998 and 2000, the taste came under severe threat from competitors. And NASDAQ obviously was the main competitor. Again, dozens of Israeli issuers went directly to NASDAQ. NASDAQ at the time established a European extension called NASDAQ Europe that directly and openly tried to attract Israeli startup companies. ECGI was a NASDAQ wannabe, again, European market that, again, openly addressed Israeli potential issuers to list on its market. And again, at the time, the late 1990s, a number of European markets established growth trading lists under the name Novo Mercado, Nouveau Marché, Neuer Markt, and whatnot. And then they somehow collaborated under the brand name Euro and M. All of these competitors were direct or posed a direct threat to the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, which meant that there's no time to be wasted. And in 2000 or 2001, the big compromise was made, and essentially David yielded to Goliath. The Ministry of Finance, the Israeli Securities Authority, the ISA, said, okay, we're going to give you, they told the issuers, the Israeli issuers abroad, we're going to give you whatever you want. Just do whatever you want and be automatically listed in on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And that meant that you would they would apply with a lower quality regime, the 20F regime. The big compromise here was not entirely senseless. The regulators and policymakers here sacrificed investor protection, which we usually think about securities regulator as being in the business of, for the sake of market protection. They saved the market, the local market, while paying some price in investor protection currency. A few details about the DLA. From kind of a bird's eye perspective, it implements a strategy that I call unilateral recognition. Essentially, it's national level piggybacking on another country's securities regulation infrastructure, the laws, the regulation, and so on. You could either view it as free riding another country's securities regulation system or infrastructure. The idea of unilateral recognition was in the literature in the late 90s, a couple of papers by Choi and Guzman, a couple of papers by me. But again, there's no point in mincing words. This was a case of blatant regulatory arbitrage, clear and explicit race for the bottom, cutting corners aggressively for the sake of gaining business for the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. The principle, in a little bit more detail, combined lower quality disclosure with some hope that there would be higher quality market environment, market discipline, market social norms in NASDAQ and the American national markets, kind of infiltrating or radiating to the Israeli market. And there was a lot of reliance, or at least talk about reliance, on the high quality supervision by the SEC. Again, from the point of view of the issuers, the potential issuers who would come from the NASDAQ to the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, the point was, the bargaining position was zero extra regulatory burden. They wanted minimal friction with the Israeli system. You could imagine this as, we don't want to see an Israeli court from the inside. We don't want to know how the offices of the ISA, the Israeli regulator, look from the inside. So the DLA is based on not filing a prospectus, just sending a letter to the ISA, to the regulator. Look, we've just listed on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. There's reporting only of the foreign disclosures, obviously in English, both mandatory and voluntary. So press releases that are not called for by law are still need to be filed and publicized in Israel, but nothing beyond that. And there's a provision about stay of local litigation in Tel Aviv in deference in case there is foreign litigation in the foreign market. Voila, success. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange was saved. There's no question about that. By the end of last year, slightly less than 10% of firms listed on the TASE, 52 out of 548 were listed under the traded under the DLA, but they stood for roughly 50% of the market by market cap and by trading volume. And the DLA was later expanded to lower cap US trading lists. There are some subsections of both the NYSE and NASDAQ, and the DLA was extended to them as well. It was extended to the LSE, the Toronto Stock Exchange, and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, arguably after the Israeli regulator looked into the quality of disclosure standards and the quality of the regulator there. Okay, wishful thinking. And that's about it. It's a nice story. However, the other half of the story is a story about a big mess. And that's because the issue of liability in the DLA was completely neglected. It's simply undefined in the legislative amendment. And it's not entirely clear why. Paloma was generous enough to mention, I was part of this project at its late stages as a pro bono consultant to the ISA, and the issue of liability, I think, was swept under the rug on purpose, because there was provision, there still is that provision about kind of lis alibi pendens, staying of litigation in Israel, provided there's litigation in the foreign market. But again, there was no reference to the substantial law of liability. And I wrote a paper in Hebrew at the time, essentially saying, Tel Aviv, we have a problem. Which law applies? Is it Israeli law? Applies to liability. Is it Israeli law or the foreign law? It's not easy to figure out which law applies, because you have both civil liability and public criminal liability. There are, considerations, pros and cons for applying US law to the liability, given that the disclosure is done according to American rules, but this doesn't sit quite neatly with applying American criminal law in Israeli courts. And again, the overarching design principle was the logic of zero regulatory burden, or minimizing the friction between those DLA issuers and the Israeli regulation regime, and also the realization that there was a compromise about quality, a policy decision to compromise about the quality of investor protection for the sake of other interests. However, the resolving this issue of this question of liability, even just civil liability, proved to be kind of via dolorosa of sorts. This comes from the real place. So between 2008 and 2022, there was like about a dozen cases looking at different angles. The district courts said that US law applies to civil liability because of, integrity, harmony, logic. It doesn't make sense to apply Israeli liability law to American disclosure rules. The issue of public enforcement and criminal liability was pushed to one side. However, although there are quite a number of district court cases, the Supreme Court has looked at the issue, but said that, it thinks that should be US law, but it didn't issue a decisive ruling. So we're still out in the open. And after the Supreme Court said, we think that, or we're pretty much convinced that US law applies to civil liability, a district court took advantage of the undecisiveness of the the Supreme Court position to rule that Israeli law applies. So we're in a kind of a stage of uncertainty. Morrison, the U.S. Supreme Court seminal case in Morrison versus National Australia Bank came in the middle. Israeli court said Morrison is none of our business because US law applies to civil liability because the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, said so, not because of some interpretation of what Congress said in the American securities laws. The ISA, for, again, inexplicable reasons, remains hesitant. I would even say inept. It filed several amicus briefs saying that US law should apply to civil liability, but it didn't promote any legislation, which it should have long ago. And there are additional issues that I won't even bother you with that call for resolution, could be resolved obviously, nearly obviously, only through legislation. Meanwhile, in America, US courts learned to understand the DLA. They were first, again, hesitant in light of the US decision in Morrison, but then they absorbed the kind of the point that Morrison doesn't apply. US law applies to civil liability because of Israeli law, not because of American law. And this allows US courts to consolidate traders in the US with traders in Tel Aviv into a single class, consolidated class, certain supplemental jurisdiction, which makes things quite efficient in terms of resolving disputes or managing litigation, transnational litigation in terms of civil liability. And this, to conclude, it's a story about a little market that could, which is, you know, a happy story in a way. It's a story about regulatory innovation under pressure that yields good results. Again, you don't often hear happy stories about regulators. It's a story about regulatory dualism of sorts, but, you know, kind of twisted or flipped on its head, but again, still successful. But there are remaining loose ends to this regime. So that's basically for countries that are interested in piggybacking, relying on experimenting with regulatory dualism. It's basically a story about caveat regulator. The devil is always in the details. And that's it.
Thank you, Amir. So Carsten, your turn.
Thanks very much. I don't need the screen. I don't need slides. So can we put the screen down? It's a bit in the way.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Can I first thank Maribel for inviting me? It's a pleasure being here, and it's an honor to be able to participate in this tribute to Henry Hansmann, whose work I've admired for a very long time, and also thank you to Miguel for the excellent organization. Special thanks to Amir for sending me his paper, which I greatly enjoyed reading. Amir said it's, when he started his presentation, it's an unambitious paper. It's a short paper, okay, but I think it's not unambitious. It raises a host of very interesting questions. So to my mind, it's not really just one paper, but there are at least two very ambitious papers in it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I should say I know very, very, very little about Israeli law. I know only marginally more about US law, so I'm maybe not the best person to comment, but I'll do my best. So to my mind, how I read your paper, I think there are two stories that you're telling. One is a regulatory competition story, and you describe this innovative initiative from the Israeli policymakers, unilateral recognition or submission, sort of wholesale submission to another legal system. You questioned that a little bit. I got the sense from your paper that you are rather quite critical because you see that the policymaker compromised on investor protection standards. And I think I sense that also in your presentation, but on the other hand, you say it's also a success story. So you identify this tension between high investor protection and market protection, as you put it in the paper. I'm not sure that is a tension. So I'm going, that's my first set of comments will surround that, will be anchored to that part of your paper, or that theme in the paper. And the second theme, and possibly a second ambitious paper, would be what you call the civil liability morass. The difficulties, rather technical difficulties that the Israeli policymakers experienced when they implemented the DLA. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about that and have some questions, some thoughts. So first, on the regulatory competition or unilateral recognition theme. I was a bit surprised how much you made of the low quality features of the regimes that Israel opted into, because normally you don't associate US law, US securities regulation with a low quality regime. And neither, I think, would you, I might be biased, but neither, I think, would you associate UK law, for example, with a low quality regime. And I wonder if I can probe this claim a little bit, that is what you observe here in your case study is an illustration of a regulatory race to the bottom. You say there are two main differences between Israeli law and US law. One centers around disclosure duties, and there especially you explain in the paper disclosure of related party transactions, and executive remuneration is more stringent in Israel, and then about civil liability. On disclosure, US law, of course, offers also a very extensive regime, and at least at the point of issuing, I think the form F1 for foreign issuers, if they opt into that, is also fairly comprehensive. But Richard, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, if I say something nonsensical about US law, which is possible. So you have this clearly disclosure duties, fairly far-reaching disclosure duties. And I'm wondering if you overstate this case a bit. Also on civil liability, you mentioned Scienta as a standard under Rule 10b-5. That's of course a high hurdle. I would think Section 11 should also apply to foreign issuers that are registered in the United States, if I understand correct, Section 11 of the Securities Act, and that is a very forceful prospectus liability provision. It has a number of advantages over other prospectus liability regimes I'm familiar with. I don't know about the Israeli case, but it is certainly more forceful than prospectus liability in UK law. I would also think more forceful than in German law and French law. So those legal regimes that I'm somewhat familiar with. For a number of reasons, it's very forceful. It has strict liability without a due diligence defense for the issuer. It has no requirement of reliance showing. It has loss causation is also a defense. And then it very clearly sets out who are the possible defendants. Not only the issuer and corporate insiders, but also, and that's extremely important, I think, and that's a big gap in UK law, certain experts and the underwriters. It's very clear. Under US law, it's very unclear under UK law, which I think poses a big obstacle to litigation, or a big disincentive to start litigation in the UK in the first place. So these are forceful provisions in the United States. I'm not sure you can really talk about the regulatory race to the bottom. Irrespective of this point, so irrespective of the question whether there is lower level of investor protection, if assuming there is, in comparison with Israeli law, by Israeli policymakers opting into US law, assuming that has led to a compromise of investor protection standards. The next question that I think would be interesting to address is whether that actually whether that indicates a race to the bottom, whether it's appropriate to say this is a race to the bottom. Maybe it's a race to an efficient equilibrium. Clearly, the theoretically highest possible level of investor protection will very likely be inefficient. And the fact that the markets into which Israel opted, US, UK, other markets, Toronto Stock Exchange, Hong Kong, Singapore, are large, highly liquid markets, might be an indication, at least if we are supposed to believe at least parts of what law and finance research says, could be an indication of a robust regulatory environment. So maybe the Israeli policymaker didn't get it that wrong. In any case, it would be interesting to explore that question. That's your first follow-up paper, to explore that question further. And I'm wondering, for example, whether there are Israeli companies that opt into that issue in the United States under a Form S1 or S3, and those that opt into the regime for foreign issuers, and whether that makes a difference in valuation, for example. So there are interesting empirical questions, I think, that you could pursue. So that's my first set of comments. Now coming to the civil liability morass. That's a very interesting part of the paper, I think. It's fairly brief, so that will be your second follow-up paper. It's very interesting because of there are a number of reasons, or a number of thoughts I had when I read that. You say there was legal uncertainty initially, that increases regulatory costs. Clearly, that is convincing. The legal uncertainty is to some extent removed because we have now some case law which, at least to some extent, clarifies that US civil liability laws apply to the DLA. But you made the point in your presentation now, there is still some legal uncertainty. That in itself is something that is not conducive, of course, to business and to facilitating the growth of a stock market. I'm wondering, and that's the interesting question that you could explore if you wanted to dig a little bit deeper. I'm wondering if there is, for a regime such as the DLA, that is based on unilateral recognition, there's something like you could call it an inevitability of having an incomplete or ending up with an incomplete regime. What I mean with that is the following. First of all, I try to understand a little bit better what the courts reason when they say, both the Israeli courts and the US courts, you reference one US judgment, when they say US law applies. That seems to go, to my reading of Morrison, against Morrison, or at least it's a lenient interpretation of Morrison, where the courts could have adopted a stricter reading of Morrison. If the investors are in Israel, if the transaction takes place in Israel, the securities are listed in Israel, and the only feature that connects the case to the US is a cross-listing. So how I read how you describe the legal situation in your paper, and how I read the one Israeli judgment I found in English translation on the internet, is that but correct me if I'm wrong, that the Israeli court doesn't really seem to care about the precise formulation of Morrison, or the precise international scope of application of Rule 10b-5, but says, well, there's no issue of comity because we are submitting ourselves to US law. So the issues identified by the US Supreme Court in Morrison are not really that relevant.
We had blaring out over all their heads. I don't want it to go on. So I'd rather take a risk than not get missed.
And
So I can't listen and work on this at the same time.
It's okay. Okay, so imagine now that the US courts had adopted a different interpretation of Morrison. As it stands, there's no issue of comity or of conflicting views of the Israeli courts and the US courts. Now, if the US courts had adopted a different interpretation of Morrison, a narrow view that would take any liability claims from Israeli investors because of misrepresentations based on a securities transaction in Israel outside the scope of Rule 10b-5, would the Israeli court still say US law applies? That seems to go against international comity because it disregards certain aspects of US law. There's an equivalent, equally problematic or more problematic case if the international scope of application of a foreign civil liability provision is not determined based on the territoriality principle, but based on conflict rules. Then you can come, I think quite realistically, you can end up with a disintegration of the relevant legal regime, or a separation, so that you have several legal regimes, aspects or elements of several legal regimes applying simultaneously. Imagine that we're talking about UK law, where the international scope of application would be determined according to conflict rules, also in securities regulation. So imagine you have cross-listing on the London Stock Exchange, and then you have Israeli investors that want to bring a lawsuit in Israeli courts for misrepresentations, incorrect disclosures. And imagine further, in my hypothetical, that they want to bring this lawsuit not only against the issuer, but also against the underwriters. So the Israeli court will look at the application of UK law. They will first look at the statutory prospectus liability provision, that is Section 90 of the Financial Services and Markets Act. I already mentioned it in passing, where this is the counterpart to Section 11 of the Securities Act in the United States. Whether underwriters are liable under Section 90 of the UK Act is highly questionable. Underwriters are not explicitly mentioned, and probably on the most convincing interpretation, they are not captured by Section 90. Does Section 90 apply? Yes, it does, because again, there are some legal uncertainty surrounding these questions. We don't have case law in the UK on this, but the most convincing interpretation would be that Section 90, the prospectus liability provision, applies if there is a UK prospectus and that contains a misstatement. So Section 90 applies, but doesn't give the investor the opportunity to sue the underwriters, most likely. For that, you would need to look at different bases, different causes of action in UK law. And that would be the equivalent to Rule 10b-5 in the United States, if you want to draw these comparisons, would be, I would think, the tort of deceit. Yeah. Or there's also tort of negligent misrepresentation, so it's not necessary to show scienter, but it would be, in any case, tort law. Different conflict rules apply here. The applicable law is determined according to the applicable law is the lex damni, so that's the place we mentioned, we talked about that over lunch. That's the place where the damage occurs. The question, it might be a debatable question where the damage actually occurs, but one thing is for sure, in my hypothetical, it doesn't occur in the UK. So you will end up with a different applicable law unless the Israeli courts decide to ignore UK conflict rules, but that would go against established principles of private international law. So you would have two liability provisions applying under two legal systems. And depending on the situation, you might have the weakest elements of each legal system combining. Section 90 not particularly strong, potentially a tort of deceit-like provision in another legal system also not particularly strong. That leads to regulatory gaps. That's just one, and that is something that doesn't even have anything to do with the Israeli courts being unsure about what to do. It's simply a consequence of having an international context and applying conflict rules. And that's just one example of regulatory gaps that can arise. Another example would be, or another obvious case would be, and we mentioned that over lunch as well, that Israeli law only opts into substantive US law, so only into the private litigation side, into the civil liability provisions. US law is maybe not the best example for that. UK law might be more so. You can think of cases where there are certain substitutabilities between the private enforcement side and the public enforcement side, that there might be weaknesses on the private enforcement side. I think that's the case in the UK, but you have a reasonably competent public regulator who is reasonably well resourced and is enforcing regulations reasonably stringently. Might be also a matter of debate in the UK, but you have well-working public enforcement. And with the DLA, you would only opt into the private enforcement side. So you can again end up with the weaker elements of different legal systems. And that is something now, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to how to solve that, but that is a challenge I think that any policymaker who wants to copy the DLA will need to think about carefully, and which will require very careful drafting in order to avoid, and very good understanding of the foreign law, of all aspects of the foreign law, in order to avoid regulatory gaps. So thanks very much. That's all I have to say now, but I'm very happy to continue that conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carsten. Okay, so I think we have something like 20 minutes for open discussion and questions. So for those of you connected online, I think the best or the easiest is that you write down your questions on the chat and we can read them. And well, if you want.
Henry has his hand up, right?
Okay, Henry, yeah, your hand's up. So maybe you want to share with us something.
Or Henry or Mariana could type it. Is there a chat function?
There is a chat function here, so maybe that's why.
You managed to silence them. Can you unmute them as well?
No, I can't.
No.
Only mute.
Okay,
Now, Maria.
Yeah. Turn on the camera.
Okay. Okay, so as I mentioned, if you want to write down questions on the chat, that will be fine. So maybe somebody in the room wants to break the ice and ask some question or make some comment to the speakers and or discussants. Yes, please.
Hello. They can't hear
Hello.
Hello, hang on, let me try.
Hi, Henry. We can hear you.
But with the
You can hear me?
infinite regress like the subsidiaries.
Double. I think there's echo.
Yeah. It's happening again.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, yeah, we can.
Okay, we're going to switch computers here and hope it helps. You do it.
Prova.
You do it.
Just say. Can you hear Henry?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, there's no video though. I get no video on my end. Oh, here we go. Here,
Yeah, we have no video, Henry.
yeah, I've got you all. Everybody on the main panel is in my sights here. Okay.
There we go.
Can I say a word or two?
Yeah.
Okay, my apologies first of all for my very late appearance and my clumsy introduction of myself into the discussions. So it's, of course, it's a wonderful thing to have a conference in honor of your work, and this is no exception. It's been a terrific boost and source of gratitude for me to have this conference and to have Maribel Sayers set it up for us. She's herself a core member of the European Law and Economics Group. That's been so promising in recent years, I think. And she also did a great job in rounding you all up for this conference. She almost let me get away, but here I am. So let me say a word about writing these papers. These papers were mostly co-authored, many co-authored with Richard, and his name should properly be first on the paper that he's presented today. As you can imagine, I am kind of the big think guy. I come from the Yale Law School, and I look for puzzling anomalies and or features of the law, let's put it that way, that at first seem a bit odd if you look at them hard. If you don't look at them hard, it's just the way you've always seen them, and they present no problems. But I've run around looking for things that everybody knows about, but nobody ever talks about. Asset partitioning, especially inside veil piercing, and I found these phenomena. Everybody knows that a business corporation isn't liable for the debts of its shareholders, but nobody quite points it out or puts a label on it. So we pointed it out and stuck a label on it. And then Richard came along and analyzed it in detail. So I recommend this method to you all. It's lovely to have other people write your papers for you, or think up the solution. Sometime in the it's debatable when, but I would say the 14th century, we formed the first joint stock companies, and they had entity shielding. So we're dealing with a device here that's been around for a long time, but lawyers had never come up with a name for it. Excuse us here, we're making noises. But back to you all. I think that this integration of the law of bankruptcy and debt on the one hand, and the law of corporate governance on the other hand, is a sweet marriage, and it's going to tell us a lot. It has told us a lot, as you all have pointed out. It is the frontier, and I'm counting on all of you all to, as I go into my dotage here, I'm counting on all of you to carry the ball forward and score with it. So thank you all for coming, for participating, for giving your papers. Thank you, Maribel, especially for all you've done in this connection, and for me. It's a heartwarming and invaluable thing to me. Let me just throw in one substantive idea that may be of interest or may not. It's come to my attention recently that banks in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, were essentially reputational intermediaries. That is to say, they basically sold their reliability. And that reliability, I believe, though I don't know, was a behavioral question. This is for Amar, maybe. This fits maybe well with his oeuvre. And so the question is, does one treat a pure reputational intermediary? That is, they would sign no, they would sign a note. You were going to pay Sam $100,000, and you would the bank would write a note for you for $100,000, as you probably know better than I, and would pass it on to, would give it to the purchaser, who would then give it to the person he was indebted to at a discount. The discount measured how much the parties believed that the guarantee was a good one. And this informal method of trading became familiar through bills of exchange and similar inventions, and went well into the 19th century. It stopped this role for banks, which is they always paid off. They got a good reputation by always paying off, doing whatever it took to make sure they always paid off. And it doesn't much matter how they did this, how they bonded themselves, whether by having large reserve funds, which some of them did, or whether just by paying their bills on time, by backing up all the notes that they countersigned. If that's the role they played, and the role they played until 1873 or so, when the United States adopted national currency, which obviated the need for these fiduciaries as intermediaries. So we've got an example here that doesn't quite fit our models, in the sense that we can't model the amount of security, the amount of debt, and the amount of credit that an institution gives out in purely financial terms. We need to have some other method, some method based upon what's at stake for the parties. And maybe more broadly, I offer this just to remind us that that entity shielding, or entities themselves, may serve complicated purposes, and some of them are hard to model. And I think that's true with bills of exchange and the guarantee of notes in general, the core function of the banking industry, and then until the 19th century. So I let it go at that, and I thank you again for coming and for presenting an interesting set of discussions. I was here since I arrived. In my awkward fashion, just as Richard was speaking, and I know that paper pretty well, so I don't think I missed anything much in it, and I'm hopeful that I got all of you. I think I did, and it was great to meet those of you I didn't know, telephonically, as it were, and it's great to hear your theorizing about this particularly valuable area of the law, we believe. So I say goodbye, and many thanks to you all for traveling, if you've traveled, or for hanging on for the telephone line or the internet, as it were. And I hope to be seeing you all soon at other events to celebrate me. What can I say? So many thanks to you all, and you are the ones who are going to keep this going for the next generation. So so I look forward to what you do. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you, Henry. Would you like to say anything? No?
Henry, this is Richard. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure you're aware that Oliver Wendell Holmes described the common law as a brooding omnipresence in the sky. You can't see this, but you have been cast above us all here on a very large screen as we've been talking, kind of watching over us. And so I felt like you have embodied the brooding omnipresence in the sky. And I'm sure it has a salutary effect on all of us. So I'm sorry that you're signing off.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's good to know that the angel was up there because I needed the angel occasionally to help me through. And that angel's been very good to me as I produced a number of articles, many with Richard, which have titles like The End of History for Corporate Law and other things, chosen to sell copies instead of get respect. So I thank Richard for all his help in these projects.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have a question in the room. No? Yes? No? Anybody in the room willing to make some comments on the presentations, discussion? Okay.
So I'm sorry if I've asked this question before, but I don't recall the answer. It just occurred to me that I might have asked before. I'm really interested in this paper and this theory because I'm in Brazil. I'm from Brazil, and Brazil has adopted Hansmann and Krachmann's theory more than any other jurisdiction. So in Brazil, there's broad liability for torts committed, for instance, for environmental harm. That's Hansmann and Krachmann. And more recently, just a couple of years ago, our bankruptcy statute was amended to specifically provide for substantive consolidation and regulate it, I think very much along the lines of this paper. And one of the things that the statute says is that the presence of cross guarantees should be grounds for substantive consolidation. And so I have a question for you, which in a way is also a question of statutory interpretation under Brazilian law, which is a question about the magnitude. So how would you go about that? Would only one cross guarantee count? Would you have a threshold in terms of the amount of credit, in terms of the number of debtors? So Brazilian law has embraced the concept, but I think there's more to be said in terms of applying it, and I would love to hear your views on it.
I'll start on that. Henry may want to comment on that as well, but first of all, I compliment on Brazil on being out in front of us in terms of our view on what is the proper way to interpret the presence of these intergroup or cross guarantees. As we say in the paper, they have both a kind of offensive and defensive function, the offensive function being that the guaranteed creditor gets a higher recovery than he or she would otherwise. And there are good reasons to think that that's not something the law should encourage. And just to be clear, step back for a second, why we say that. When a company is insolvent, the assets are fixed. And so if you are awarding some parties for collecting more, other parties are by definition collecting less. It's a zero-sum game. However, any resources expended in trying to get a bigger cut of the pie are a social loss, right? So if there's a pie and we can't make it any bigger by cutting it differently, but we can spend a lot of time and money on lawyers fighting over how we're going to cut it. In the end, there are fewer calories to go around for the rest of us because we spend a lot of money on the lawyers and the fighting and so on. So to the extent that the guarantees are just changing the division of a fixed pie, there's a good reason to think maybe these higher recoveries shouldn't be encouraged. However, they can also have this defensive function, which is to protect you from moving value around, moving the cherries in the cherry pie from one slice to another. You don't care if you're getting a kind of a percentage of the whole thing. And so the magnitude is an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have anything interesting to say on magnitude, other than that the creditors who tend to get the guarantees do tend to be the biggest. biggest. So it's not often confronted as a matter of practice that a small creditor gets the guarantee. Usually it's the ones with the biggest loans. And so the magnitude question usually is kind of coextensive, or the degree of magnitude is coextensive with the importance of the creditor, which also is with the guarantee. Now, there's a different or related question, which is you could have a corporate group in which there are 50 subsidiaries, but only 3 give the upstream guarantees, and they're usually upstream. And then would you say, is that evidence to consolidate the whole group? And I don't know what the statute says in Brazil. I'd love to see it. Our paper would say that no, that would only militate in favor of consolidating those 3 entities, because what we have is an indication that the creditor who received the guarantees was concerned about the shell game, about moving assets around within those 3. He or she wanted to be protected against that possibility, but if you put them together, then it doesn't matter where they lie. The very fact, indeed, that other subsidiaries were excluded from the guarantee scheme could be evidence that the creditors of those guarantees really did want to keep them separate. So that would be one way that this could relate to the tailoring kind of point in our paper. So Mariana, what is the rule in Brazil in the statute? If there's just a few subsidiaries, do you consolidate everything, or is it ambiguous in the statute? Right. I've been preempted by other scholars. I've never been preempted by a legislature in my scholarship. Fortunately, most people in the United States don't read Portuguese, so they won't know I've been, Henry and I have been preempted. As long as, Mariana, you'll stop talking about it. Thanks very much.
Okay, we have time just for one more question, please.
Okay, well, I have one for each, but I will be very brief. I have one for Amir, and has to do with, you've given us figures about the size.
Put on the mic.
It's not on, yeah.
It is?
Now.
Okay, I'll have it closer. You've given some figures about the size of this second market, but what a percentage of the liquidity of the issuers is in the US, and what percentage is in Israel? Because I can't imagine if 90% of the liquidity is in the US and only 10% is in Israel. I think just the strategy of, let's essentially free ride on everything that goes on US law makes sense. If 90% of the liquidity is in Israel, then I think that strategy is a bit, I know nothing about the institutional structure, but would seem to me a little bit more risky than in the other case. And for Richard, I think it is related to Mariana's question. It has to do with, in the sense what you're presented here is that, well, you may have zero consolidation or full consolidation. You've said, well, these are two extremes. We could have a lot of intermediate things. And having intermediate solutions will, in principle, make a lot of sense, in the sense that for creditors, you essentially smoothen the payoff function without increasing risk. You actually decrease risk for the creditors. In your example, before you could get either 50 or 75, you're the bank. Now you can get 50 or 67 or 75. That is less risky in principle. The question is whether really you also increase this distributional moves by lawyers and by debtors and creditors. But in theory, I don't see that there is a reason. The fact that everything becomes slightly less risky than with just two options would seem to me to decrease the incentives to invest resources in trying to get closer to your preferred solution or your preferred outcome.
Well, thank you, Fernando, for make me feel young again. This is a brilliant question that I've dealt with long ago. But because there are legal implications to where liquidity is, and there's a related question: where is price discovery in dual-listed stocks? Empirically, Most of the liquidity is in the United States. It's a bigger market, and investors, especially institutions, prefer to trade there. But there's a substantial liquidity also in Tel Aviv because of different time zones. So you would find institutions trading here and there and doing very, very fierce cross-market arbitrage all the time and overlapping trading hours. But other than that, taking advantage of the different time zones to trade during an extended part of the day. Again, the short answer is most of the liquidity in the big dual-listed stocks is in the United States. Price discovery is also interesting, and there, I mean, there are only old empirical studies. Price discovery tends to be more dominant in Israel. So the Tel Aviv market tends to lead the way in terms of absorbing new information into prices. And that makes a lot of sense because those companies are based in Israel. News make their way more quickly to the Tel Aviv stock exchange in comparison to the US market. And you would think, I mean, you could think about legal implications about the location of price discovery, insider trading, a whole host of interesting questions. So that's basically it.
So thank you. This is also a great question about how does our proposed framework encourage strategic behavior before the fact. And in the United States, at least, because there is no corporate law as in itself requiring the preparation of books and records. It's just if somebody, an investor in the company, demands it. Currently, the managers don't have an incentive to prepare subsidiary level records because nobody's asking for them. The creditors don't ask and the shareholders don't ask. The shareholders just want consolidated records, the consolidated balance sheet. So if our test is whether you can keep the entity separate, you don't consolidate it, you don't pool it in a bankruptcy proceeding, is that, well, it then has to have maintained, I don't want to say accurate, but that's because that's somewhat question begging, but at least thorough books and records. Well, who would be demanding that up front? Well, it would be the creditors who would want to make sure that regardless of what happens to the other subsidiaries, whether they're pooled or not, this one is not, it's kept separate. And so the company would reasonably say, okay, we will prepare separate books and records for you, but it's going to cost you because that's more expensive for us. It's classic lending finance theory. It's essentially a bonding cost that the borrower is bearing, and bonding costs increase the expected cost of debt. And so what's nice about that is the party who is going to argue after the fact that his or her entity should be kept separate will have to bear the costs up front of demanding that separateness, the social costs. Also, it's nice because if the books and records are kept up front, it creates positive externalities for the other creditors in the entity. And so although whenever you have positive externalities, a good can be undersupplied. And I'm not sure we can figure out at this point a way to solve the undersupply problem. I think there is a pretty good alignment of incentives here where the parties who would be normally asking for separateness after the fact, which can impose administrative expenses on others, so there'd be a negative externality, will be bearing costs before the fact that cause them to externalize those costs and also minimize the subsequent externality because the administrative costs don't have to be borne because they have been because the books and records have been kept. And so I think that there's an alignment of incentives in the particular criterion that we are focusing on, which is whether the subsidiary has been keeping the records actively all along. And I think that you could very well have a corporate group where it's intermediate in the solution because some subsidiaries creditors have demanded those records and others have not. So the ones that have not can be pooled and the ones that have can be kept separate.
Okay, so we need to close here. So please let me say a big thank you to the audience, for those being connected and those being here. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And of course, big thank you to Henry, and big, huge thank you to Richard and Amir, and of course to Jonathan and Carsten for, where are you here, for for helping us to learn quite a lot. I know a little bit more about corporate governance now, and this is good news for me. So thank you. That's it. Thank you. So I think you have a coffee break now. Is it outside? Same place? That's it. 10 minutes coffee break. Thank you.
See you later, Henry.